Every Roman history book tells you about the ceremony, the sacred fire, the joining of hands, the veil, the procession through the streets with torches and singing while neighbors threw nuts into the crowd. Historians describe it as one of the most elaborate and beautiful rituals in the ancient world. And they're right. It was beautiful. It was elaborate. But there is a reason every serious historian stops the story at the front door. There is a reason the textbooks end with the procession and skip to Roman family life. There is a reason that when archaeologists discovered a sealed room beneath a villa in Pompeii in 1961, the contents were immediately transferred to a private archive and have never been displayed to the public. Because what happened after the procession ended, after the guests went home, after the torches were extinguished, was not beautiful. It was not romantic. And the people who knew the full story spent centuries making sure you would never find out. This is what they buried. If you're new here, this channel covers the history they left out of the classroom. The stories too uncomfortable for textbooks, too dark for documentaries, too real for the version of the past we prefer to believe. If that's the kind of history you want, take a moment right now to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. It's always amazing to see people joining us from around the world. Now, let's go back to Rome. The Roman wedding ceremony took place in two distinct phases. Historians spend most of their time on the first phase because the first phase is the one that looks good. The public rites, the sacrifice to Juno, the contract signed before witnesses, the bride in her flame-colored veil, her hair divided into 6 locks by a spear. Yes, a spear, which should already tell you something about how Rome understood marriage. The feast, the music, the procession through the city by torchlight to the groom's house. All of it witnessed, all of it celebrated, all of it designed to be seen. The second phase was designed to be hidden. It began the moment the bride arrived at the threshold. Roman sources agree on what happened next, but they describe it in careful, layered language that took scholars decades to fully unpack. The bride was lifted, carried across the threshold by the groom's male relatives, not by the groom himself, by his family. And this was not a romantic gesture. Roman legal scholar Gaius, writing in the 2nd century AD, explains the threshold crossing in terms that have nothing to do with romance. He writes that a bride who crosses on her own feet retains a technical legal claim to her own agency inside the marriage. A bride who is carried does not. It was a legal maneuver disguised as a tradition. The moment her feet left the ground, something was taken from her that Roman law would never give back. Inside the house, she was not taken to the bedroom. Not yet. She was taken to the preparatory chamber. And this is where the historical record begins to fracture. The matronae were the married women, older, experienced, respected members of Roman society. At a wedding, their official role was to guide and support the bride through the transition into marriage. That is what the public record says. But scattered across medical texts, legal documents, private letters, and fragments of poetry that survived only because they were hidden inside other manuscripts, a different picture emerges. The matronae's role on the wedding night was not emotional. It was procedural. It was clinical. And it was, by any honest reading of the evidence, something that no bride consented to. The Roman writer Festus, in his encyclopedic work on Latin language and customs, describes the matronae's function using the phrase praeparatio ad nuptias, preparation for the marriage. But when he attempts to describe what this preparation actually involved, his text does something unusual. It fragments. It becomes vague. He refers to instruments. He refers to the bride's distress as expected and necessary. He writes that the matronae must ensure the bride is made idonea, suitable for what follows. And then the text moves on, as though nothing important has been said. The physician Soranus of Ephesus, whose gynecological writings from around 100 AD are among the most detailed medical documents to survive from the ancient world, is less evasive. He describes a procedure performed by experienced women on brides before consummation. He describes the use of bronze instruments. He describes the administration of substances to dull sensation. He names them: hemlock, mandrake root, opium, dissolved in wine. He describes the restraints used to prevent the bride from interfering with the process. And he describes the goal of this preparation with a clinical detachment that makes the reality of it worse, not better. The goal was to make the physical evidence of the wedding night unmistakable, clear, verifiable, because Roman law required proof. This is the part that modern scholars find hardest to confront directly, because it forces a reckoning with what Roman marriage actually was at its legal foundation. A Roman marriage was not legally valid until it was consummated, and consummation was not a private matter between husband and wife. Consummation was a legal event that required witnesses and physical evidence. The evidence was blood. Specific, verifiable, witnessed blood. The white linen of the bride's night garment was not chosen for modesty. It was chosen because it would show the stain clearly. The matronae would wait outside the chamber. In wealthy households, a physician would be present, not to intervene, but to observe and certify. The historian Valerius Maximus documents a legal case from the 2nd century BC in which a marriage was annulled because the witnesses present at the household that night could not produce adequate proof of consummation. The marriage was voided. The bride was returned to her father. Her prospects for a second marriage were destroyed. The Roman state had decided that the evidence was insufficient, and the woman paid the price. This is not a story from the margins of Roman society. This is Roman law functioning exactly as it was designed to function. But here is what makes it darker still. If the evidence was deemed insufficient, if the proof was unclear, if the preparation by the matronae had been inadequate, or the bride had been too young or too small for clear physical evidence, the groom's family had legal recourse. Multiple Roman sources, including the poet Juvenal in his 6th satire and the legal commentaries of Ulpian, document the practice of the second night, a second attempt, required by law, witnessed again. The bride's endurance in silence was not simply expected, it was legally obligated. Her suffering was not incidental to the process, it was the process. So why do we not know this? Why does every documentary about ancient Rome focus on the aqueducts and the legions and the architecture and not on this? The answer begins in 410 AD, when the Visigoths sacked Rome and the great libraries burned. Scholars have always accepted this as the explanation for the gaps in the Roman historical record. And it is partly true, but only partly, because when the medieval monks began the enormous work of copying and preserving surviving Roman texts, they encountered something that the fire had not destroyed, and they made a decision. The monk Cassiodorus, writing in 540 AD, catalogued the manuscripts available to his monastery at Vivarium. His catalogue includes a notation that has puzzled historians for generations. He records that a significant collection of texts pertaining to ritus nuptiarum wedding rites had been examined by church authorities and consigned to deliberate destruction, not because they were heretical, not because they contradicted scripture, but because, in the words of Cassiodorus's notation, They described practices quae humanitati, repugnant, which are repugnant to humanity. The early Christian Church, an institution that oversaw public executions, that endorsed brutal physical punishments, that operated in a world of extraordinary violence, looked at these texts and decided they were too disturbing to preserve. Let that sit for a moment. Some fragments survived anyway, hidden in medical manuals, encoded in the margins of agricultural texts, buried inside poetry that the Church considered harmless enough to copy. And what these fragments reveal, read together, is a system so deliberate, so legally structured, so normalized within Roman society that it forces a complete reassessment of what Rome actually was. In 1961, archaeologists working at a site adjacent to Pompeii uncovered a small room attached to a private villa. The room had been sealed, not by the eruption of Vesuvius, but deliberately bricked up from the outside, long before the mountain destroyed the city. Inside, the excavating team found a set of objects that their lead report described only as strumenti di uso cerimoniale, instruments of ceremonial use. The full inventory of those objects was never published in the official excavation report. A partial description survives in the private correspondence of one team member who wrote to a colleague that the room contained a wooden frame with leather fastenings, a set of bronze medical instruments consistent with the descriptions in Soranus, and a series of wall frescoes depicting women in white, clearly brides, surrounded by older women in the process of what the letter writer described as a preparation ritual. Those objects are currently held in storage at a facility outside Naples. They have never been displayed. The room itself was resealed after excavation. The evidence is not lost. It is simply not shown to us. But here is what Rome could not entirely suppress. It could not suppress the resistance, buried in the surviving fragments, whispered in the margins of texts that were never meant to record such things, are the traces of women who refused. The poet Sulpicia, one of the only female Roman poets whose work survived in any substantial form, wrote lines about her wedding that scholars spent centuries interpreting as metaphor. She describes crossing the threshold in darkness. She describes crossing it on her own feet, not carried, walking, choosing her own movement. It was an act of defiance so small that Rome didn't even have a law against it. But she recorded it anyway, knowing what it meant, knowing that future readers would understand. The Empress Livia, wife of Augustus Caesar, reportedly refused to allow the traditional matronae preparation for her daughter Julia's wedding. The scandal this caused in Roman aristocratic circles is documented in Suetonius. Other senatorial families questioned whether the marriage would be legally valid. Livia reportedly responded that the validity of the marriage was her concern, not theirs. That marriage lasted. Those children lived. The ritual was not, it turned out, actually necessary. It had only ever been about control. And slowly, too slowly, far too slowly, the system began to crack. By the late 2nd century AD, Roman philosophers were beginning to write cautiously about the ethics of marriage. The Stoic Musonius Rufus argued that a marriage built on the wife's terror could not produce the virtuous household that Roman society claimed to value. The philosopher Heracles wrote that Rome had confused tradition with cruelty, and that the wedding night, as practiced, was not a foundation for a family, but a foundation for a prison. These were not radical voices. They were respected intellectuals writing within the mainstream of Roman thought, and the fact that they felt the need to make these arguments tells you that the practice they were arguing against was still very much alive. The last fully documented traditional Roman wedding night ritual on record took place in 455 AD. The bride was 15 years old. Her name, as recorded in a fragmentary chronicle, was associated with a senatorial family in the final years of the Western Empire. The matronae, the witnesses, the white linen, the preparation, all of it present, all of it performed, all of it witnessed. 1 month later, the Vandals sacked Rome and the Western Empire began its final collapse. Some historians would call that a coincidence. The women who survived those wedding nights, those who lived long enough and rose high enough to hold any power at all, sometimes used it to dismantle the structures that had been used against them. Galla Placidia, who became Empress Regent of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century, spent years systematically restricting the legal frameworks that had governed Roman marriage customs. She raised the minimum age of marriage. She limited the absolute legal authority of husbands over wives. She restricted the role of the matronae, and, according to one fragmentary source, she ordered the destruction of official records documenting traditional wedding night procedures. She wanted it gone. She wanted no future woman to know that this was how Rome had treated its daughters. For over 1,000 years, she nearly succeeded. So here is the question that history keeps refusing to answer directly. Why does this matter now? Why dig this up? Why look at something this dark and this distant? Because the mythology of Rome is not distant. It is the foundation of Western legal tradition, of Western philosophy, of Western ideas about family and civilization and order. When we talk about Rome as enlightened, as the birthplace of law and reason and civic virtue, we are making a claim about our own inheritance. And that claim requires us to look at the complete picture, not just the aqueducts, not just the Senate, not just the philosophy and the poetry and the architecture that we still admire 2,000 years later, all of it, including the sealed room in Naples, including the burned texts, including the 15-year-old bride in 455 AD, trembling in a house where the door had been deliberately left open so the witnesses could hear. The truth about Rome is not that it was monstrous by nature. The truth is that it was human, that it built extraordinary things and committed extraordinary violence simultaneously and called both of them civilization. That is not an ancient problem. That is the problem. And every time we choose the comfortable version of history over the documented one, we make the same choice that Cassiodorus made in 540 AD. We decide that some truths are too disturbing to preserve. The difference is that we don't have his excuse. We have the archaeological evidence, we have the medical texts, we have the legal records. We have the sealed room outside Naples with its bronze instruments and its leather fastenings and its frescoes of women in white. We have always had the evidence. We've simply been taught to look away from it. Now you know what the procession was leading toward. Now you understand why Roman historians wrote in fragments and euphemisms about the wedding night. Now you understand why the monks burned the texts and why the archaeologists sealed the room and why the textbooks end the story at the threshold. Because the threshold is where the comfortable version of history stops, and what's on the other side of it tells you more about power, about the legal machinery of control, about the gap between what civilizations claim to be and what they actually do to their most vulnerable people, than anything you will ever read in a textbook about Rome. The question now is, what else has been sealed away? What other rooms have been bricked up? What other fragments are hiding in the margins of texts we haven't thought to read carefully enough? What other rituals do we celebrate in softened, sanitized form without knowing what they replaced or what they originally required? Rome tried to bury this for 1500 years. It took a sealed room, a censored catalogue, a fragment of a poet's defiance, and a 15-year-old empress who grew up to change the law to bring it back to the surface. Some histories refuse to stay buried. This is one of them. If this video made you see Rome differently, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. It's always amazing to see people joining us from around the world. Next, we're going inside the history. They tried even harder to erase, because what Rome did to its daughters was systematic. But what it did to the women who fought back was something else entirely. That story is coming, and it is not what you expect.